All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Cranky Pundit podcast. I'm your host, Mike Morgan, the Cranky Pundit. I hope all is well. I am buzzing after Liverpool's result during the week against Wolves, so it's all set up nicely for Sunday's game against Man United. One of the biggest Liverpool-Man United games in recent years. Now, I know Liverpool have been going for titles in recent years, and Man United have been battling for top four. But this is literally, if Man United win, this cements their domination over us, possibly for the next 10 years. I can see it happening. I was talking to a buddy of mine and we were talking stocks. Now, I don't know anything about stocks, so hear me out in this, but Man United are actually available to buy as a stock. And if you think about it right now, let's just look at it like a business. Man United, they're just coming up now, winning a Carling Cup, getting a couple of nice players. Maybe their club might be sold to some rich Saudi Arabian or Qatari guy. So they might be bought out. They might go on away and win everything for 10 years. So if you buy a stock right now in Man United, which would make me sick, I think it would be a good investment, so I might actually do it. Well, if you can't beat them, own them. That's what they say. I don't think they say that. But it's going to be some game on Sunday, guys, between Liverpool and Man United. Arsenal beat Everton 4-0. Everton are in huge trouble. I still think the signing of Sean Dyche might keep them out of the relegation zone. And as well, Arsenal, after losing to City, it's all about your response. That's what champions do. It's how you lose a game, it's how you respond. And the last two games, lad, they're just after cracking back into it. Which, as a Liverpool fan, I'm sure as a United fan, Chelsea fan, anyone that doesn't support City, which is very few people, just want Arsenal to go win this title. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's Man United fans that don't want Arsenal to win this title and would prefer their next door neighbours to win it again. But I could be completely wrong. I just don't understand why you would want your local rivals to win the trophy than some crowd down in London that don't matter to you, really, but what do I know? So anyway, guys, I've made a list today of the worst managers for your club in the Premier League era. Now, what I based it on, some of it is stats, some of it is their losing percentages, some of it is just vibes, some of it is their man management, and some of it is the legacy they left behind. Just a bad manager, no good for your club, and I'm open to being wrong like all the lists I make, guys. I'm open to be wrong. I get plenty of messages in with different lists than mine, and they're often better. But this is all opinion, and this is what... so this is not in the last 10 years, no, guys. This is the whole Premier League era, okay? So from 92, is it? 91, 92 onwards. So I had to do a bit of research and go back for a few clubs because some clubs are just doing outstanding the last 10 years, let's say, and they didn't have a bad manager. So I would have to go back into the early noughties or the 90s to find a bad manager for that club. So let me know what you think, guys. I'm up for being disagreed with on this. This is what these lists are all about, you know what I mean? Just opinion. You can chat back. All I want this podcast to sound like, guys, is one of the boys. I am not Sky Sports News. I am not Talk Sport. This is just one of the boys chatting shit about soccer like you used to do in the classroom. Do you know what I mean? Do you remember in fourth year there in school, you'd be like, make the best all-time team. I'm that guy at the back of the class. That's what I am. I was that guy, still am that guy. So, yeah, don't get your facts from me. Just vibes from me, boy. Just vibes, all right? So, okay. So we'll start off. The worst manager in the Premier League era for Liverpool was Roy Hodgson. Now, this wasn't a hard one to pick. Roy Hodgson, he signed players like Poulsen, Joe Cole, Jovanovic, Konchesky, right after he got Fulham to the Europa League final. I mean, he could have brought Danny Murphy back instead of Poulsen. Now, a big shout out must go to Graham Souness in the early 90s and Roy Evans in the mid 90s. They were also not great for Liverpool in a bad time, but I have to give it to Roy Hodgson. It was dark times. Torres started leaving, Mascherano started leaving, and we're bringing in apes, and we've like David Ungog up front. It was a horrible time. Now, I'm not saying Roy Hodgson was a bad manager. If you actually go through Roy Hodgson's whole career, he's managed Inter Milan. Like I said, he's gotten Fulham to the final of the Europa League. Fulham, do you know? With players like Paul Konchesky, like Bobby Zamora. Got them to the final. Like, you can't be a bad manager. I just think... similar enough to the time David Moyes took over from Alex Ferguson. Whoever got that job at Liverpool at the time, it wasn't going to go well. Our owners, Hicks and Gillette, wanted to leave. They pulled out all the money. Gerrard was getting older. Xavi Alonso had left. Mascherano wanted to leave. And nobody really wanted to come in. It was dark times. But what I will say, Roy Hodgson, you are coming from Fulham. Like, bring us Clint Dempsey. Bring us like Danny Murphy. Bring Damien Duff. There was a lot of good players on your team there that you could have brought, but you picked the left back, Konchesky, you know, which is enough said. I actually like Roy Hodgson. I think he looks like a decent guy. If I ever met him, I would love to sit down for an hour and talk to him. He looks like an interesting, kind man. But as for this list, he is the worst Liverpool manager in the Premier League era, in my opinion. Maybe you think Graham Souness or Roy Hodgson or Gerard Houllier were worse, but I honestly think that we can all agree Roy Hodgson was the worst Liverpool manager. So we'll move right on to, from my beloved Liverpool to my main rivals, Manchester United. The worst Manchester United manager in the Premier League era is between Ole Gunnar Solskjaer and Ralph Rangnick. Now, I am going to pick Ole over this. Ralph only had 6 months. He was promised that he was going to go upstairs afterwards, and that didn't come to fruition, so I'm picking Ole. Now, Ole was like one of the boys being the manager. It's like having one of the boys. He doesn't want to fall out with you. He's a yes man. Do you want to do that? Do you want to go on holidays, Paul Pogba? Hey, Cristiano Ronaldo, do you want to start every game and finish out the 90 minutes every time? Of course you can, because I'm your friend. That's what he was, guys. And as a Liverpool fan, it was some of the best moments of my life watching Ole Gunnar Solskjaer in an interview afterwards going, we wanted to start on the front foot. He's not from Russia. I know he's Scandinavian of some sort, but like the man had a face on him like a rabbit caught in the headlights after every interview. You've lost 4-0 to Brighton. Oh, well, we wanted to start on the front foot, you know. Lad, hilarious. So I am going for Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. Now, you can disagree with me, Man United fans. Do you think Jose Mourinho was worse? Do you think Van Gaal was worse? Do you think I should have picked Ralph Rangnick? No, personally, I just think Ole Gunnar Solskjaer was probably the worst manager that I've ever seen in my lifetime in a top 4 club. I go out and say that. He was just tactically inept. If inept means what I think it means, he was tactically, is it right? My editor's telling me it's right. Tactically inept is what he was. There you go. Big word for a dyslexic fella. Alright, okay. So we'll move on to Manchester City. Now, it was hard to pick a Manchester City one because in the last 15 years they've had a load of money and they've had top class managers. So even if they didn't do great, they're still a top class manager. So I had to go a bit deeper for Manchester City's worst manager. So the worst manager in the Premier League era for Manchester City was Stuart Pearce. The reason I am picking Stuart Pearce, he didn't have the lowest win percentage, but what he did on the final day against Middlesbrough, when they were 1-0 down, he brought on goalkeeper David James as a striker. Not only that, he had a jersey, an outfielder's jersey printed with number 1 James on it. It was premeditated. So what he said afterwards was, if we needed a goal and we needed the crowd behind us, I'm going to bring David James on to get the fans behind us. It wasn't met with a round of applause. It was met with a load of boos, and Man City got relegated, and it was one of the worst managerial substitutions I've ever seen in my life. Like, can you imagine being the sub-striker? Who was sub-striker for City at that time? Darius Vassell or something. Can you imagine being him? It's like, boss, are you fucking serious, mate? Why can't you you're paying me 30 grand a week and you're bringing on a goalkeeper, boy. Do you know what I mean? Like, do you even want me here? Like, do you know? So I will say that Stuart Pearce is the worst Man City manager in the Premier League era solely because of that. Oh my God, you know what I mean. Anyway, shout out to Mark Hughes as well, who only lasted 6 months. Mark Hughes could have got in this list, but I believe he signed for him in the summer, and then by winter they were bought out with a load of billions, and those owners didn't want Mark Hughes. So it wasn't really his fault, but he just came at the wrong time, or the right time, whatever way you look at Manchester City's success. We'll move on to Aston Villa. The worst Aston Villa manager in the Premier League era was Remy Gard. Now, this guy is often on a list of the worst managers in Premier League history. He's hard to get on with, very strict. He banned Jack Grealish from the first team over something very small, and he was sacked 9 months into his career. A very hard man to get on with, despite playing for Arsenal earlier in his career. Now, Di Matteo just missed out. Di Matteo actually does have the worst Aston Villa record, with only 1 win out of 11, but that was in the Championship. So he actually just misses out on this list because his failures came in the Championship, not the Premier League. So I'm going with Remy Gard as the worst Aston Villa manager in the Premier League era. So we'll move on to Chelsea. Now, again, similar to City, Chelsea have had a rake of managers since the money came in. And do you know what? They've actually had a rake of managers before the money came in. Like, they had Glenn Hoddle, who wasn't that great. Was it Ruud Gullit? Not that great. They had a couple of guys that just weren't brilliant. Now, when Claudio Ranieri came in, Jose Mourinho, things started to go a bit better. But the worst Chelsea manager in the Premier League era is Andres Villas-Boas. This man's voice would drive you insane. And my accent, I'm not one to talk, you know. So he was under 35 when he started managing Chelsea. So players like Didier Drogba and John Terry were older than him. So a mutiny started and they got rid of him. And just a couple of months later, Chelsea won the Champions League with Di Matteo. So it showed that Andres Villas-Boas actually had a Champions League winning squad on his hands, but could not achieve it whatsoever. And Di Matteo came in and worked absolute wonders. He himself got sacked shortly after winning the Champions League. So Chelsea, Andre Villas-Boas. Now what I will say is Graham Potter is getting awfully close to sneaking into this list. I'm not going to put him in because he's a current manager and he could probably go on to win the Champions League this season. So I'm not going to say it, but like with the way Graham Potter is going, it's probably worse than Andre Villas-Boas, lads. It's actually awful. When you think it's actually what he's doing right now, it's terrible how it worked out. And I am personally delighted. With all your money, you can fuck off. Anyway, so we'll move on. We went to Everton. So guys, Everton have had an awful amount of shit managers, and just an awful amount of managers. They've had more managers than I've had hot dinners in the last few years, I'll be honest with you, like, you know. But in my opinion, there can only be one, not because he was a bad manager, just because it was a terrible choice. So the worst manager in the Premier League era for Everton is, of course, Rafa Benitez. What were the board thinking in signing an ex-Liverpool legend? It was one of my favourite times in my life when Rafa took over at Everton. We were all like, Agent Rafa. No, he didn't do that bad. It's like if you brought Alex Ferguson into Liverpool. Yeah, he might do great, but like, we don't want him, man. He's our rival's legend. We don't want him. I don't care if it's Jesus Christ himself. We don't want him, man. Do you know? So that was like the worst signing in Everton's history. Worse than Dele Alli, worse than Sandro, worse than all these fellas. That was the worst signing. It got the fans on the board's back to a point where they haven't got off it ever since. So they shot themselves in the foot there, Everton. So West Ham, that's what I'm going with next. The Bobos, the Hammers, the Londoners, whatever you want to call them. The Clarets, whatever. So the worst manager in the Premier League era for West Ham was Avram Grant. Now, Avram Grant did amazing things at Chelsea. He would have won the Champions League if John Terry didn't slip, right? But he had a horrible stint at Portsmouth and an even worse stint at West Ham. In his time at West Ham, he couldn't motivate the players, which I get because he looks like a boring guy, and they faced relegation at the end of the season, and he was handed his P45 after they got relegated. Avram Grant, and never seen him in the Premier League ever again. Now, that seems harsh because West Ham have had a couple of poor managers. They actually have. But I'm going for this guy just because he sucked all the motivation. Not only were West Ham playing bad football, but you know, when you just see a guy at the sideline that just, he's like a fun, what do you call something that sucks the fun out of things? There's a word for that. Anyway, he's dead, right? So, right, okay, we'll move on to Arsenal. Now, Arsenal was probably the hardest one to do, because if you look at all the teams in my list, Arsenal were probably the most consistent throughout the whole Premier League era. Maybe bar Liverpool, but Arsenal have been finishing in the top six, like throughout, even before Wenger, they were finishing in the top six, and after Wenger, they've been finishing in the top six. So, very hard to pick an Arsenal one, but I have, okay? So, the worst Arsenal manager in the Premier League era is Bruce Rioch. Again, very hard to pick a bad Arsenal manager in the Premier League era, but Bruce Rioch was in charge for the 94-95 season. They finished 5th and got knocked out in the 3rd round of the FA Cup. Not a disaster by any means, but he fell out with all of the players. Now, that being said, Bruce Rioch was the guy that signed Dennis Bergkamp. So how bad could he really have been? That's Arsenal. Again, guys, like I said, it was really hard to find an Arsenal one, but Bruce Rioch, the Scottish guy, he's going in there, fell out with Ian Wright, fell out with a few of them, but he signed Dennis Bergkamp, so how bad can he be? How bad can he really be? Alright, anyway, we'll move straight on to Spurs. The worst manager in the Premier League era for Tottenham are Nuno Espirito Santos or Andres Villas-Boas. Villas-Boas. Now, the reason I'm picking Andres Villas-Boas and not Nuno is because Andres Villas-Boas had a longer stint in charge and did even worse. This is the guy that was in charge of spending all the bail money on fellas like Saldago, Paulinho, Bentaleb, all these flops. He spent all all these money on these flops. And again, like Chelsea, his voice wrecked my head and he sucked all the motivation out of the room. So I'm going for Andres Villas-Boas for the second time on this list. Worst manager in the Chelsea era and worst manager in the Spurs era. I'm going for that. You can't pick Nuno really because he only had 2 months in charge. Simple as. And did he even do that bad? Probably not. He didn't do that bad. And had he had time, he could have changed things around. Who knows? Do you know? So for the second time on my list, I'm going for Andres Villas-Boas. And he's so young that he probably could even turn it around. Like Andres Villas-Boas, is he out in St. Petersburg? That's the last time I seen him anyway. But like the man's he must be only 45 for a manager. That's very young. So like he's loads of time left to turn it around. Okay. So we'll go to Leicester next, and the next guy, he's a snake. I don't even like him. So the worst manager for Leicester City in the Premier League era is Craig Shakespeare. This guy's a snake, solely responsible for getting Claudio Ranieri sacked. This man was in the board's ear saying he's not the height, he's lost the dressing room. The man just won the league 6 months ago, and you want to get rid of him. You're a snake, Craig Shakespeare. And then Craig Shakespeare got the job, got a 3-year deal, and was sacked by October, and Leicester were in the bottom 3. You are a clown, Craig Shakespeare. I didn't even like the look of you, boy. You have a shit second name as well. Nah, you have a class second name. I'm just jealous, to be honest with you. But yeah, no, Craig Shakespeare, worst manager in Leicester's history in the Premier League era. Now, if you cast your eyes back, they did have a couple of bad managers after, let's say, Neil Lennon or Martin O'Neill or stuff like that. But yeah, Craig Shakespeare's a snake in the grass. So that's why I put him in there. He deserves to be in the list. And I hope he watches it. You're a snake. How dare you get rid of Claudio Ranieri? Like, if we get the clean sheet, I buy everybody a pizza. Like the nicest manager of all time. How could you, do you know? Fucking bullshit. Anyway, Craig Shakespeare. Go fuck yourself. Anyway. So we'll move on to Fulham. Fulham wasn't going to be in my list, but there is just one man that has to be in every bad manager's list. The worst manager in the Premier League era for Fulham was, of course, Felix Magath. This guy was loco. So after a defeat, he took the bus back to Craven Cottage, and instead of telling the players go home, they had a match in the parking lot. They played 4-4-2 without a ball for 90 minutes. This is after getting flogged 2 hours ago, and he made them train like that. All the confidence was gone, sucked out of that team. They got relegated later that season, and even players like Sid Stevewell, all those kind of guys, they said he was the worst manager that they've ever worked under. So there you go, Felix Magath, you're coming in my list. Okay, next up is Southampton. I had to do this. I'm going to do an ex-Liverpool legend, pretty dirty, but he was pretty bad at most clubs he was at. So, the worst manager for Southampton in the Premier League era was, of course, Graham Souness. This guy did not do good jobs anywhere he went. He was bad at Liverpool, bad at Newcastle, bad at Blackburn, but the reason he's on my Southampton list is because he signed a player called Ali Dia. This man was not a professional footballer. In fact, he was conned into thinking that he was. He brought him on one game in the 77th minute, and he was substituted 5 minutes later in the 82nd minute, and we never seen him again. Ali Dia, the man that conned Graham Souness and made him look like an absolute fool. So that's why he's going in my list. I love Graham Souness, to be honest with you. He's an ex-Liverpool legend, hard man. Even today, he looks a bit soft. He's a vegan. He looks healthy. I love Graham Souness, but like, he's a bad manager, clearly. When you go through all the stats, he's a bad manager. Very angry. A bit too angry to be a manager, which is throwing at Roy Keane an awful lot. But yeah, I'm going to go with that. Graham Souness as Southampton's worst manager. Now, I know that Southampton recently have had some bad ones, like your man that just got sacked there. Has to be. But no, just... Man, you brought on a player that wasn't even a professional footballer. Like, you have to be on my list for this one, like, you know. So up next is Newcastle. I'm including this fella, and I feel sorry for him because he's dyslexic, I'm dyslexic, and he made some very dyslexic mistakes. So, look, hear me out. The worst manager for Newcastle in the Premier League era was Joe Kinnear. Now, this guy was dyslexic, I'm dyslexic, I can really feel his pain, but he used to pronounce players' names wrong all the time. He called Charles Nzogbia Charles Insomnia. Well, then Charles moved to Wigan the next day. He was so offended. An awful amount of players said he didn't have respect for him because they wouldn't remember his name. I think that's a bit harsh on Joe, as he lost his job at Newcastle and was diagnosed with dementia 3 months later. So it might have been his fault, all this kind of stuff. But as a dyslexic dude, I completely feel for Joe Kinnear, because my girlfriend Jessica is not happy with how I pronounce her name either. So yeah, guys, Joe Kinnear being the absolute worst at Newcastle. No, Newcastle had some bad ones. I was going to put in Alan Shearer, but he's a club legend. He didn't want to be the manager in the first place, and the only reason he was put into being a manager is to keep him up in the last 5 games. He didn't do it. He lost all the games, but like, he was only like the last throw of the dice. Get him in there. Let's try win something. So I'm not putting down Alan Shearer, even though technically he was the worst. Even though technically he was the worst. I'm going for Joe Kinnear, Charles and Sanmia. That's hilarious. All right, okay. So, guys, yeah, that's my list. No, I didn't make one for Burnley. I didn't make one for Bournemouth, because Burnley have had Sean Dyche. Bournemouth have had Scott Parker, Eddie Howe. They've had good managers, and as well, they haven't been in the Premier League long enough to have 10 different managers to pick a shit one. So that's the reason why I didn't do that one. So I'll just go over it quickly again. Liverpool, I picked Roy Hodgson. Man United, I picked Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. City, I picked Stuart Pearce. Aston Villa, I picked Remy Gard. Chelsea, I picked Andres Villas-Boas. For Spurs, I picked Andres Villas-Boas. Everton, Rafa Benitez. West Ham, Avram Grant. Arsenal, Bruce Rioch. Leicester, Craig Shakespeare in Love. Fulham, Felix Magath. Southampton, Graham Souness. And Newcastle, Joe Kinnear. So they're the worst managers for your club in the Premier League era. Guys, thanks very much for listening. We've over 100 followers now on YouTube. We're only getting going on YouTube. We're only 3 weeks old, and we got to get that puppy to 1,000. So guys, if you haven't already subscribed to my YouTube, please do. It really helps. And if you're listening to this on Spotify, please give it a 5-star review. It really helps boost the podcast. Tell a friend about it. All that kind of jazz. I'm really appreciative of it. So later in the week anyway, guys, we have a quiz with Psychic Dan and all that. So it's coming out on a Saturday this week, I believe, because we're meeting up a day later. So yeah, check that out at the weekend. Come on, Liverpool Sunday. Come on, the pool. Peace and love, y'all. Peace and love.